There were some really tough encounters in round 2 of Norway Chess. And Ishigiri tried for almost 6 hours to defeat Sergei Karyakin. He was a pawn up, but in the end, Karyakin, well, we know how tough he is from the World Championship match last November. He managed to hold the draw. Levon Aronian was a pawn up against Nakamura. He also tried very hard to win, but couldn't do it in the end. These guys are so tough defensively. Then there was Wesley So against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. The Frenchman was also a pawn up, but actually Wesley So held the draw very easily. And Carlsen held the draw very easily against Fabiano Caruana. Neither player risked too much there. So that leaves us with the game between the two former world champions, Vishwanathan Anand, with white, against Vladimir Kramnik. So Anand with his favourite e4, and now Kramnik plays bishop c5. A little bit of a sideline of the Spanish, but it can lead to very, very complex positions. For example, after the main move c3, and then black allows white to play d4. But yeah, it's very, very double-edged. But it seems as though Anand wasn't prepared to go in for a full-blooded fight in that way. He didn't want to test any theoretical lines. Played knight c3, which is really quite a tame move. And played knight d5. So, I mean, this is slightly unusual. Of course, one could simply play d3 in this position. But knight d5, well, that offers the pawn on e4. Now, Kramnik is a very principled player. You know, here black does not need to take that pawn. However, Kramnik thinks if there's a pawn on offer, well, by rights, I should just take it. That's what he did. Now, white does have some compensation here. In order to break the pin, then the black bishop needs to come back to e7 and stop the pawn structure being damaged. And that means that white can now grab that bishop. So Anand has the two bishops, and there's some compensation for the sacrificed pawn, because of course there's pressure here, and you know the queen is on the same line as the rook, and that pin is a bit annoying. It's not so easy to break when there's no dark squared bishop. So first of all, h6. Well, Anand could trade pieces here and play bishop d5, but well, he kept the tension, and I think that's a correct decision. And now he goes to play d4. So, well, it's of course necessary to push now to take the pressure off that pawn. But, well, it's obvious that white has some comp here because of this. So Kramnik needs to play g5 in order to hold that pawn. So you can see that he's got this bishop, knight, queen and rook all defending the e-pawn. So 4 pieces defending, only 3 attacking. But g5 is without doubt a concession. Now here Kramnik said that he was very anxious to prevent white from spinning that knight round to e3. Of course, that starts to look at this wonderful square here on f5. So that's why he played knight c4. Good move. So obviously knight f1 allows knight takes pawn, not too good. So Anand has to trade. That takes a bit of pressure from the e-pawn. Now, Anand could get the pawn back with bishop here, but that rather sidelines this bishop. And then black can blockade on d5. So understandably, Anand didn't want to grab that pawn. Instead he played b3. Well, that looks like a good move. Of course, if this is taken, then suddenly white has a nice centre. So Kramnik maintained or set up a blockade on d5 to hold that pawn. This looks correct. Now here is a really important moment in the game, because Anand has to decide what kind of strategy he wants to make for the middle game. The move that would keep the most tension in the position is h4, just nibbling away at that pawn, and then we might be able to attack it with queen d2. And there's no doubt that white has compensation for the pawn. But instead, Anand played bishop e5, which regains the pawn. So Kramnik played this, Anand took the knight off, then took on c4 and recaptured his pawn. But after the exchange and rook e8, there's no doubt that if anyone is better here, then of course it's Kramnik, because look at his 3 pieces, all active. While white, I mean particularly that rook on a1, are out of the game, not taking part. So for me this was a rather strange decision, and showed a loss of nerve by Anand. Instead of keeping the tension, he was keen to get the pawn back and trade pieces and try to hold a slightly worse position. So he traded bishops, but the queen takes the bishop's place, and black controls this open e-file. Anand played queen b3. Well, trading queens would not be favourable for black, so of course Kramnik keeps the active queen. h3 to give the king an escape square. Yeah, in fact, it's funny. g5 now looks to starts to look like a very decent move, because it gives the king some room. There's no danger here. There are no weaknesses. I mean, white can't exploit those weaknesses. And even later on, it might be possible to start some kind of attack with h5 and g4. King g7. So black is in control. Softly. Improves the position of the king, just edges up the board. Always good to get the king off the back rank. And now, for the moment, white just has to sit tight. So, but it's a bit miserable having to play the rook into f1. And Kramnik said he had, maybe ideas of swinging the rook and maybe something like this. And queen d2, that just pegs the queen back, and protects this one. As I said before, maybe h5, queen c4, hitting 2 pawns, and now a5. And this is another important moment in the game. Anand basically was a bit too eager to simplify here. He thought that he was simplifying towards a draw by taking on c7. He should hold the tension and play a4. Black is still better here. White has some hard work before he manages to get a draw here. But still, that's what white should do. But instead, Anand took on c7. Now, in playing this, he imagined that he was going to simplify. I mean, this is the game continuation. He thought that c5 was simplifying to a draw, but he'd missed that this holds everything together for black. Now, obviously, if queen takes, then black is just a clear pawn up. And if pawn takes pawn, here's the important variation. So black has to prevent queen takes pawn, and now rook d6 prevents the pawn queening and collects the pawn, and black would just be a clear pawn up there. Excellent winning chances. So this was Anand's problem. Now, material is still even, but now Kramnik has this serious passed rook's pawn. And, well, in combination with the fact that white is so passive on the king side, this is extremely dangerous. But things got worse here. Anand should probably hold tight and try to hold this position. Maybe king h2, possibly g3, something like this. Instead he went for f4. Well, he was a bit short of time, and it's a bit desperate. Of course, white would love to get some counterplay against the king. The problem is that Kramnik exchanged rook straight away, and because white has played f4, this rather exposes the king, and that makes it easier for black to advance his rook's pawn. So this is the game continuation. And now Anand hurries back with the king to try and find some shelter. And here, well, after the game, Kramnik said that he said, I wanted to win in grandpa style. In other words, he wanted everything to be safe and protect everything. And as he said, very often if you play too safely in queen and pawn endgames, you can actually mess things up. He said afterwards that he thought probably a3 was winning and that it might be the best move, but you know, he was worried about white's queen coming in and getting counterplay here and some kind of perpetual check. But okay, I'm following a computer line here. These positions are notoriously difficult to calculate. Queen and pawn ending is incredibly difficult. But I think this line illustrates how the exposed king here, or relatively exposed, actually turns it into a win for black. So this king is running around, but eventually it finds safety. But of course, I mean, this is impossible to calculate at the board. Absolutely impossible. So white has the threat of the pawn queening hanging over his head. So obviously it's important to try and get, you know, some kind of perpetual here. In fact, I think, yeah, this is actually a threat to get a perpetual now. But black defends like this. Very important that the queen is prevented from going behind the pawn. And the king escapes. Now, if black had to come back to protect this pawn, of course, then white would have his chance at the other end of the board. But here's the trick. With the king slightly exposed, a winning move is queen b8 check. And if king back, then queen b1, and then you queen. And that's that. Or after queen b8 check, if g3, again, there's no f-pawn, the king is exposed, you can give a check, and then queen on the next turn. Now, as I said, impossible to calculate, but it's interesting that Kramnik felt that a3 was the best move, but you know, he couldn't work it out, so preferred to play something simple and safe. He just took a pawn off, so he's a clear pawn up. There are no complications. He wanted to win, you know, he wanted the ripe apple just to fall into his hand, but well, he almost messed up. Let's have a look. So we've got some shuffling here. And then finally a3. And now here's the point, that while black is taking care of this pawn with the queen, then white's queen has a chance to try and hassle black on the other side of the board. So, you know, for example, queen b2, that's the move you'd like to play, but then queen takes pawn check. So some checks to repeat the position, gain a bit of time, and now queen e3. So it's for the moment, Kramnik is just holding everything together. And here again, objectively, king g6 is probably the best move. And then, you know, the king wanders up the board, and it should find safety, should avoid the checks, but you know, Kramnik wasn't sure, so he played this move f6, another grandpa style move, as Kramnik called it. So just protecting everything, but of course this does expose the king to some extent. So more checks to repeat the position. So Kramnik just holding things for the time being. and maybe the king is going to march up and everything's protected. Who knows? Or you've got to be careful of a skewer here. But you know, if the queen moves back, you know, if the queen checks here, for example, you know, it could be the king marches up the board. King g6. So that queen is covering this crucial square here. And now, apparently, the best move is queen c4, which gives white the best drawing chances. I suspect that this position should be winning eventually for black, but it's tricky and things can go badly wrong in queen and pawn endgames. So instead, Anand played queen a8, and now it is definitely winning for black. Let's see how Kramnik did it. Queen b3, excellent move. This is what he was hoping for some time, because in this position, after queen e7 check, queen f7 is the move. So obviously trading queens, the pawn goes through. Here Anand resigned actually, and if queen takes pawn, then a clear winning move is queen a7. So everything's defended along the 7th rank, and then the pawn gently rolls home. So Kramnik got there in the end. Disappointing from Anand, but I have to say, I feel he didn't want to keep the tension in this game. He wanted to simplify in a couple of crucial moments too quickly. So that leaves the scores after 2 rounds. Well, there's lots of players on 50%, but there are 2 players in the lead, Vladimir Kramnik and Hikaru Nakamura, both on 1.5 out of 2.